The words that shattered the entire illusion of my marriage were spoken over a glass of sparkling water at a dinner table in downtown Boston. "Honestly, your family is embarrassing, Caleb, they don't belong in this world." I remember the exact sound the room made after that sentence, a kind of polished silence, like everyone was waiting to see if I would finally react. Olivia didn't even look uncomfortable when she said it. She looked practiced, like she had said versions of it before, just never in front of this many witnesses. Her mother, Patricia Blake, smiled the way people smile when they think the conclusion is already settled. Around us sat friends from Olivia's world, finance, consulting, luxury branding, people who measured value in silence and status. And there I was, Caleb Morgan, sitting perfectly still like I always did, because that was the role I had been reduced to in their eyes. A man who listens, absorbs, and disappears into the background. Olivia had met me 5 years ago when I was building software architecture systems for mid-sized firms in Cambridge, nothing glamorous, nothing loud, just work that kept me busy enough to ignore how often she started rewriting my identity piece by piece. At first, it was small comments, jokes about my parents not understanding modern ambition, remarks about my hometown outside Philadelphia being cute in a backward way, always framed as humor, always landing just soft enough that I couldn't challenge them without sounding sensitive. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was no softness in her voice. Just certainty. I looked at her across the table and noticed how easily she fit into this environment, how naturally she belonged among people who never questioned whether they belonged anywhere. I, on the other hand, had always been something she was polishing, correcting, improving. "You're quiet again," Olivia said, tilting her head slightly, as if my silence was a personal inconvenience to her. "Sometimes I wonder if you even realize how people perceive you when you sit like that." A few soft laughs followed, polite but sharp. I didn't respond. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that every response I gave in moments like this only fed the same cycle: I speak, I am dismissed, I defend, I am corrected, I stay silent, I become invisible. What none of them knew, not Olivia, not her mother, not anyone at that table, was that 3 days earlier I had received a sealed envelope from a law office I had never heard of, addressed in my father's handwriting, a man I thought had left me nothing but distance and silence. I had not opened it yet. It sat on my desk in my apartment in Cambridge, untouched, as if the moment I opened it something irreversible would begin. Olivia leaned closer now, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel personal. "Caleb, you can't keep hiding behind that quiet thing forever. It makes people think you have nothing inside." That was when I finally looked at her properly, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a kind of distance she had never seen before. Because for the first time, I wasn't wondering how she saw me. I was wondering what I had agreed to become, and whether the envelope waiting at home was the first real answer I had ever been given. Olivia did not wait for me to respond. She never did when the silence became inconvenient. Instead, she turned back to the conversation at the table as if I had already faded into the background again, as if I had confirmed the role she expected of me. The laughter around her resumed, lighter now, more comfortable, like a room returning to its preferred temperature after a brief disruption. I remember watching her hand gesture as she spoke to one of her colleagues, confident and effortless, explaining some upcoming marketing campaign in a way that made everything she said sound important. That was always her strength. She could turn attention into authority without anyone questioning how she earned it. I excused myself a few minutes later, not because I was defeated, but because I needed air that did not feel shaped by other people's opinions of me. Outside the restaurant, Boston felt colder than it had when I arrived. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement from earlier rain, and I stood there for a moment before calling a rideshare. My phone buzzed. Once while I waited, a message from Olivia that simply read, "Do not wait up, I might stay for drinks with my mother." No question, no warmth, just instruction. I did not reply. The ride home was quiet except for the low hum of traffic and the soft voice of the driver asking if I preferred a different route. I said any route was fine. My mind was not there. It kept returning to the envelope sitting on my desk at home, untouched for 3 days like an object that refused to become part of my reality. I remember the weight of it when it first arrived, thick paper, formal seal, my father's name written in a handwriting I had almost forgotten. I had thought about opening it that first night, but Olivia had been in one of her moods, critical, distant, and I did not want to add anything more unstable to the evening. So I left it. Then I left it again the next day. And the next. It was not avoidance exactly. It felt more like hesitation before stepping into a version of my life I could not reverse. When I arrived home, the apartment was dark except for the kitchen light Olivia had left on. She was not back yet. That was not unusual. Her schedule often expanded when she was with her family, as if she became a different version of herself in their presence. I placed my keys on the counter and stood in front of my desk for a long moment, looking at the envelope. It had not moved. It had not changed. But I felt different looking at it now, as if the words inside had begun to settle into my life even before I read them. I finally sat down, slowly, and ran my fingers along the edge of the seal. My phone vibrated again, this time a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. A calm voice on the other end introduced itself as belonging to a legal office in New York City, confirming that I was the sole recipient of a private estate directive from my late father. The words were simple, professional, almost ordinary, but they carried a weight that made the room feel quieter. I did not speak at first. The voice continued, explaining that the document required my acknowledgement before certain conditions could take effect. Conditions I had never been told existed. And as I sat there in the dim light of my apartment, the unopened envelope suddenly did not feel like paper anymore, but like the beginning of something that had been waiting for me longer than I had been ready to understand. The moment the legal office finished speaking on the phone, I remember sitting completely still, holding the edge of my desk like it was the only solid object left in the room. The voice had been calm, precise, almost clinical, but every sentence carried something heavier underneath it, something I could not immediately name. They told me the document was part of a private estate directive left by my father, and that my acknowledgement was required before certain conditions could be activated. The word condition stayed in my mind longer than anything else. I asked the obvious question, what conditions, but the response was careful, almost rehearsed, saying that everything would be explained once I physically opened the sealed envelope in my possession. After the call ended, the silence in my apartment felt different, like it had changed shape. I placed the phone down slowly and stared at the envelope again. It was still there, untouched, waiting on the desk as if it had been patient all along. I do not know how long I sat there before I finally broke the seal. The paper inside was thicker than normal correspondence, embossed with official markings and a law firm letterhead from New York City. My father's name appeared at the top of the first page, followed by language that immediately felt unfamiliar, not emotional, not sentimental, but structured like a contract designed to outlive the person who wrote it. As I read, I began to understand that this was not a simple inheritance. It was a system, something designed with rules, triggers, and restrictions that would activate based on behavior over time. There were clauses about stability, conduct, and what the document referred to as sustained relational integrity. The more I read, the more it felt like I was being evaluated rather than remembered. Somewhere in the middle of the document, I saw a reference to marriage status, specifically noting that the beneficiary must remain in a continuously verifiable marital relationship under conditions of documented external pressure. I stopped reading for a moment, trying to process what that even meant in practical terms. Then I kept going. The estate was not small. It was structured through multiple holding accounts, investment assets, and controlling interests in a private fund that had quietly grown over decades. But access to it was not immediate. It was conditional. Not on age or time, but on proof of endurance under social and relational scrutiny. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of it settle in slowly. The legal language was precise enough that it left no room for emotional interpretation. If the conditions were met, control would transfer incrementally. If they were broken, the entire structure would be reassessed. I remember thinking how strange it was that my father, a man who had barely spoken to me in years, had built something so deeply personal around my private life without ever being part of it. When I finally looked up again, the apartment felt unfamiliar, as if the walls had shifted slightly while I was not paying attention. Olivia still had not returned, and the quiet made it easier to hear my own thoughts forming questions I was not ready to answer. I closed the document and placed it back into the envelope, but I did not seal it. For the first time since the dinner, I was no longer thinking about Olivia's words or the way her family looked at me. I was thinking about timing, structure, and what it meant that someone had been watching my life from a distance long enough to design rules around it. And somewhere in that realization, a deeper uncertainty began to form, not about what I had inherited, but about how much of my life had already been measured without me ever knowing. I did not sleep that night. The envelope stayed open on my desk, the pages slightly shifted from where I had left them, as if even the act of reading them once had already changed their meaning. I kept thinking about the phrase sustained relational integrity and how something so personal had been translated into legal language that treated human connection like a measurable condition. By the time morning light came through the blinds, I was still sitting in the same chair, fully dressed, staring at nothing in particular while my mind replayed every line I had read. Olivia returned just after 7 o'clock, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor before she even reached the bedroom. She did not notice me at first. She was focused on her phone, scrolling through messages, her expression neutral in the way it always was when she had spent the night in a world where I was not included. When she finally looked up and saw me still in the living room, she paused slightly, as if my presence at that hour was unexpected but not important enough to question. "You are up early," she said casually, setting her bag down on the counter. I did not answer immediately. I watched her move through the kitchen, pouring herself water, checking her reflection in the microwave door like it was a mirror. There was something ordinary about her routine that made the situation in my head feel even more distant from hers. She finally glanced at the desk and noticed the envelope. Her eyes lingered for half a second longer than usual, but she did not ask what it was. Instead, she leaned against the counter and said, "My mother wants us to come to dinner again this weekend. I think it is time you make more of an effort with them." Her tone carried the same expectation it always did, as if my time, my decisions, and even my relationships were adjustable based on her approval. I looked at her carefully, trying to reconcile the person in front of me with the language in the document sitting behind me. For years I had accepted this imbalance as something small, something manageable, something that did not require confrontation. But now every small moment felt like it had a second meaning I had never noticed before. I asked her if she ever felt like her family treated mine unfairly. She let out a short laugh without humor and shook her head slightly. "Caleb, they are just honest about reality," she said. "Some people are built for more and some are not." It was said so naturally that I almost did not react. Almost. I watched her for a few seconds. Longer, noticing how comfortable she was with that idea, how easily she placed people into categories without ever questioning who decided the categories in the first place. She finished her water and picked up her phone again, already moving on mentally to her day. Before leaving for work she added, "Do not forget to confirm dinner, my mother has been patient with you." Then she was gone, leaving the apartment in silence again. I stayed where I was for a long time after that, until the sound of the door closing stopped echoing in my head. Then I stood up and walked back to the desk. The envelope was still there, but now it felt different, less like a message and more like a threshold. I opened it again, this time not as someone trying to understand what had been left for him, but as someone beginning to realize that the structure of his life might have been designed with expectations he had never been told he was already failing or fulfilling. And for the first time since receiving it, I stopped thinking about whether I should read further and started thinking about what would happen if I did. I realized something strange about the human mind that morning while sitting at my desk staring at the same sealed pages I had already read twice. It was not the content that changed, but the way I saw myself inside it. Every sentence from the legal document felt less like information and more like a quiet measurement of who I had been for years without noticing. When I finally closed the envelope again, it was not because I understood it, but because I was beginning to understand that understanding itself might come with consequences I was not prepared to face. Olivia acted as if nothing had changed. By the time I left for work that day, she was already dressed in a structured blazer, reviewing slides on her tablet, speaking into her headset about campaign projections as if her world had no room for uncertainty. Before I reached the door, she reminded me again about dinner with her family that weekend, this time more firmly, as if repetition would eventually turn her request into my obligation. "You need to be presentable," she said without looking up. "My mother is expecting a real conversation this time, not your usual quiet routine." I paused for a moment longer than usual, and she finally looked at me, waiting for agreement rather than response. I gave her a simple nod, not because I agreed, but because I had started to notice how little difference disagreement ever made. The office that day felt ordinary, yet distant, like I was participating in conversations that belonged to someone slightly outside myself. I answered emails, joined meetings, reviewed system architecture plans, but part of my attention remained divided, pulled back to the apartment, to the envelope, to the phrase "sustained relational integrity" that kept repeating in my memory like a warning I had not fully decoded. At lunch, I found myself searching the law firm name from the document, discovering only a minimal website with no public cases, no client stories, nothing that explained why something so significant in my life was hidden so carefully from general visibility. By the time I returned home that evening, Olivia was already preparing for her own family dinner plans. She moved through the apartment with confidence, selecting clothes, checking her reflection, speaking occasionally about how her mother had reserved a private room at a restaurant in downtown Boston. She mentioned casually that her family would expect me to be more engaged this time, especially after recent conversations about my background. The way she said it made it sound like my background was a topic that required correction. I asked her what exactly her mother meant by engaged, and she smiled slightly without warmth, saying it meant showing ambition, confidence, and awareness of how the world actually worked. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else she said that night. After she left for an appointment, I sat alone in the apartment again, and for the first time I placed the entire document in front of me instead of keeping it partially hidden. I read slower this time, noticing sections I had previously skimmed, especially one clause that referenced documented social environment assessment, a requirement that suggested my circumstances were being evaluated over time in ways I had not been informed of. There was also mention of witness validation, a condition requiring that certain interactions be observed or recorded indirectly through legal affidavits submitted by third parties. I leaned back again, realizing that the structure described was not passive inheritance, but something closer to a system that responded to behavior under pressure. And for reasons I could not fully explain yet, I began to wonder if Olivia's family dinners, her constant remarks, and the slow erosion of respect I had experienced were not just personal dynamics, but variables in something far larger that had already been in motion long before I ever opened the envelope. I did not realize how quickly silence could become a form of pressure until that evening when Olivia and I sat in the same apartment without speaking for almost 20 minutes. She was preparing for her dinner with her family, moving through the bedroom with controlled efficiency, selecting jewelry, adjusting her blazer, checking her reflection in small fragments like mirrors did not need to show the whole truth. I was at my desk again, the envelope open beside me, the pages now marked with faint creases from repeated reading. It no longer felt like a document. It felt like a system that had begun to include me whether I agreed or not. Olivia broke the silence first without looking at me. "My mother asked if you could try harder tonight," she said, her voice calm but carrying expectation. I did not respond immediately, and she continued as if my silence was already part of the conversation. "She said she does not understand why you stay so detached all the time. It makes people think you are not invested in this marriage." The word invested felt strange in that sentence, like something borrowed from another world where emotions had accounting value. I closed the document slowly and asked her a question I had not planned to ask. "Do you ever feel like your family decides what people are worth before they even speak?" She turned slightly, pausing mid-adjustment of her earrings, and gave a small laugh that did not carry humor. "That is a dramatic way to put it," she said. "We just understand reality better than most people." Some families build things, and some families just observe them. I watched her face for a moment, noticing how natural that belief was for her, how deeply it shaped the way she treated every interaction as a hierarchy that already existed before anyone entered the room. She returned to her reflection and added that I should not overthink tonight, just listen more, speak less, and try to appear engaged. Then she left for her appointment, the door closing behind her with a finality that left the apartment unusually quiet. After she left, I remained seated for a long time, but this time I was not reading the document. I was thinking about the structure behind it. The phrase sustained relational integrity had appeared too many times now for me to ignore its implication. It suggested that my life was not being judged in moments, but across patterns, across time, across repeated conditions I had never been told were conditions at all. I opened my laptop and began cross-referencing the law firm name again, this time more carefully, tracing business registrations, looking for affiliations, trying to understand why a private estate directive would be structured through such an opaque network. I found almost nothing concrete, only fragments of legal references and one mention of legacy trust governance tied to long-term behavioral observation clauses. The more I searched, the more it felt like the system was intentionally designed to leave minimal trace outside its intended participants. Hours passed without me noticing. At some point I realized the sun had fully set and the apartment lights had adjusted automatically to low brightness. I leaned back, feeling a strange disconnect between what my daily life had been and what was now unfolding in parallel beneath it. Olivia returned later that night briefly before heading out again with her family. She did not ask about my day. Instead she reminded me once more that her mother expected improvement, especially in how I presented myself socially. Then she paused at the door and added, almost casually, that her father had also mentioned he would be observing me more closely tonight, as if that detail should not matter but somehow still carried weight. After she left again, I stood alone in the apartment, realizing that what I had initially thought of as a private inheritance might already be intersecting with the very people who had spent years deciding what kind of man I was allowed to be in their eyes. I remember the exact moment I understood that tonight was not going to be a normal family dinner. It was when Olivia stood in front of the mirror for a few extra seconds longer than usual, adjusting her posture instead of her appearance, as if she was preparing for a situation that required control rather than style. She glanced at me through the reflection and said, "We need to leave in 10 minutes, my parents do not like people arriving late, especially when they are trying to assess someone." The word assess stayed in my mind as I stood up from my desk. It was the first time she had ever said it so directly, without hiding it behind politeness. I put the envelope into my jacket before we left, not because I intended to use it, but because I no longer felt comfortable leaving it behind. The drive downtown was quiet at first, except for the soft sound of Olivia reviewing messages on her phone. Then she began explaining how tonight would go, as if she had rehearsed the structure in advance. Her mother would control the conversation. Her father would observe more than speak. Her brother would likely challenge me with questions about ambition and financial planning. She told me not to take anything personally because that was simply how they communicated standards. I listened without interrupting, noticing how every role in her family seemed assigned in advance, like a performance where I had not been given a script. When we arrived at the restaurant, it was already clear this was not an ordinary dinner. The entrance was private, the lighting softer than the public dining area, and the table had already been set for 5 people despite only 4 of us being there. Olivia's parents were already seated. Her mother Patricia greeted Olivia with a brief kiss on the cheek and then turned her attention to me with a look that measured distance before words even formed. Her father, Richard Blake, stood up slowly, offering a handshake that felt more like a formality than a welcome. He did not ask how I was doing. Instead he asked how work was progressing, as if that was the only acceptable metric of my existence. The conversation began smoothly but carried an underlying structure that I could feel even before I fully understood it. Olivia spoke often, filling silence with explanations about my personality as if she had edited me into something easier for her family to interpret. At one point her mother asked if I had considered moving into a more competitive role, suggesting that stability without visible progression could be misunderstood as lack of ambition. I noticed Olivia nodding slightly before I even responded, as if agreeing with the assumption mattered more than my answer. I kept my responses measured, but internally I began noticing patterns. Every question was not really a question. Every comment was positioned as a judgment disguised as curiosity. And every silence seemed intentional, designed to see if I would fill it in a way that revealed something about my value. Then, midway through the dinner, something subtle changed. Richard Blake leaned back slightly and said he had heard my name mentioned in a private context recently, not in relation to Olivia, but in connection with a legal firm he knew through professional circles. The way he said it was casual, but his eyes did not leave mine. Olivia paused mid-sentence for the first time that evening, her expression shifting just slightly. I felt the envelope inside my jacket suddenly feel heavier, not physically, but in meaning. And in that moment I realized that whatever was written inside it was no longer something I was discovering alone, because somewhere in this carefully constructed room, parts of that same system were already beginning to recognize me. I kept my expression steady even as the atmosphere at the table subtly changed, like a room temperature dropping by a single degree that only certain people are trained to notice. Richard Blake's comment about a legal firm did not feel accidental anymore. It hung in the air longer than normal conversation should. And I could see Olivia's confidence flicker for the first time that evening, just briefly, before she forced a small smile and redirected the topic towards something safer like travel plans and upcoming business projects. Patricia, however, did not let it go as easily. Her eyes stayed on me with a sharper focus now, as if recalculating something she had already decided about me long ago. She asked, almost casually, what kind of legal firm my family usually worked with, and I answered carefully that I was not aware of any direct connections. That was true in the most technical sense, but the way I said it seemed to make the silence at the table heavier instead of lighter. Olivia placed her hand lightly on my arm under the table, but the gesture felt less like support and more like warning, as if she was reminding me of the version of myself I was expected to maintain in this environment. The conversation moved on, but I noticed it no longer flowed in the same direction. It now circled around me in smaller, more controlled loops, as if everyone was testing how much pressure could be applied without breaking the surface. After dinner was served, I excused myself briefly and walked toward the restroom, not because I needed it, but because I needed space where I could think without being observed. The hallway was quiet, dimly lit, and I leaned against the wall for a moment, exhaling slowly while my mind returned to the envelope in my jacket. I had not opened it further since arriving at the restaurant, but I could feel its presence more strongly now, almost as if the conversation had activated something inside it without me touching it. When I returned to the table, Richard Blake was no longer speaking casually. Instead, he was watching me with a level of attention that suggested recognition rather than curiosity. He asked me directly if I had ever heard of a legacy compliance structure tied to behavioral continuity. The question was precise, too precise for a dinner conversation, and I felt Olivia shift slightly beside me. I answered honestly that I had encountered the term recently but did not fully understand it. That was enough for Richard to pause, just long enough to exchange a glance with Patricia that I could not fully interpret but felt immediately was significant. Olivia finally intervened, attempting to soften the moment by saying that work-related legal terminology often gets exaggerated and that I was probably just dealing with standard estate paperwork. But her voice did not carry the same certainty it had earlier in the evening. On the drive back home, Olivia was quieter than before. She kept her attention forward, hands resting in her lap instead of her phone, as if she was thinking through something she had not fully processed yet. At one point she asked me, in a tone that was softer than usual, if I had been in contact with any law firms recently regarding my family. I told her I had received some correspondence but did not go into detail. She did not press further, but I noticed her grip tighten slightly on her seatbelt. When we arrived home, she went directly to the bedroom without speaking. I remained in the living room for a while, standing still, realizing that what had started as a private document in my apartment was now beginning to appear in fragments through other people's awareness. And for the first time, I understood that whatever my father had left behind was not just waiting to be read, it was already being quietly recognized by those who had spent years underestimating me. The next morning began with a silence that felt heavier than usual, not because anything had been said the night before, but because too many things had been left unspoken in the wrong order. Olivia was already awake when I entered the kitchen, standing by the counter with her phone in one hand and a printed document in the other. For a moment she did not look at me, as if she was waiting for confirmation that I would pretend nothing had changed. Then she finally spoke, her voice controlled but noticeably less casual than before, asking if I had any intention of explaining what her father had been referring to at dinner. I poured a glass of water before answering, taking longer than necessary, because I realized that any response now would no longer stay private. I told her I had received correspondence related to my father's estate, but that I was still understanding its contents. She studied my face for a few seconds, then placed the printed document on the counter. It was an email she had forwarded from her mother, containing a short message that referenced my name and the same legal firm I had been researching. The message did not accuse or explain. It simply requested confirmation of my involvement in what it called a scheduled relational review process. The phrasing made no immediate sense in a domestic context, yet it carried the tone of something already in motion. Olivia asked me if I had been hiding anything from her. The question was direct, but her tone was not angry. It was something more uncertain, as if she was trying to locate a version of me she could still categorize. I told her I had not hidden anything, but that I had not fully understood it myself until recently. That answer did not satisfy her, but it also did not escalate the moment. Instead, she stepped back slightly and said her mother wanted us to attend another dinner the following week, this time with her father's legal advisor present. She said it as if it was a normal extension of family conversation, but her eyes did not match the neutrality of her voice. After she left for work, I remained in the apartment longer than usual. The envelope was still on my desk, but now there was also something new, a second document I had not seen before, delivered digitally overnight, confirming acknowledgement of what it called preliminary observation status under Estate Directive Protocol. It stated that certain aspects of my personal and relational environment would now be subject to structured review. There were no details about who would be conducting the review, only references to authorized third-party validation and behavioral continuity tracking. I read it twice, slowly, noticing that the language avoided emotional framing entirely, treating my marriage, my interactions, and even my silence as measurable data points. By midday, I received a call from an unknown number. The caller did not introduce themselves immediately, only confirming my identity before stating that my presence had been noted at a private family function involving connected parties, and that this alignment had triggered the next stage of review. I asked what review meant in practical terms. The response was calm, almost rehearsed, saying that my current circumstances were now officially under structured evaluation tied to inheritance activation conditions. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, realizing that what had once felt like a hidden document in my apartment had now extended beyond me, beyond Olivia, and into a system that was already observing how everyone around me responded without needing to explain why.